Hi everybody, Steve Farmer here, bringing you a continuing coverage from round 5, the 2012 U.S. Amateur West. This is a feature game from round 5. This is between two of the contest leaders, Dan Katzel playing white at 1744 and Armit Gupta rated 1848. We're going to look at this from Gupta's side, and let's get on with it. G4, G6, E4, Bishop G7, Knight C3, D6, Knight F3, C6, Bishop E2, Knight F6, H3, castles, Bishop E3, Knight BD7, Queen D2, looking to trade off that bishop with Bishop H6, and now B5 was played. I prefer to move E5. But B5 is perfectly playable, and I have played that in the past. I've also played A6. There's a lot of options black can choose here. But B5 was played in the game. Now E5. Now Knight to E8 was played, and as far as I know, that's a novelty. D takes E5 is a little more common, and B4 is quite common. Knight to E8 was played in our game. Now Bishop H6 was played, and this is a very standard type play, but perhaps it's too standardized. Maybe it was better to play Bishop G5 first, and after pawn takes on E5, D takes E5, Knight C7, castles, and Knight E6. I think we just have a fairly level game here. But back in our game, Bishop to H6 was played, and now Bishop to B7. Dan took on G7, and I thought that Armit should play Knight takes G7. He did not. I just like this position after ED6, ED6, and castles. I think it's just level. A very typical position for black in a lot of these lines. So King takes G7 now. Kind of stymies that knight on E8. A3. I'm not covering too much of the opening here because this is a rather long game, and I don't want to spend too much time on the openings because you'll fall asleep by the time we get to the important stuff. D takes E5, Knight to C7, untangling himself a bit. Rook to D1, Knight to B6, Queen to C1, Queen C8, and now castles. Remember walking by the position, it was either at this move or a move later, and I thought, that's very unique. Dan's castled both his king and his queen. Knight to E6, Knight H2. Somewhat passive. Knight G5 seemed to make sense. Knight H2, Queen to C7, and Queen to E3. And I believe the play is pretty level here. A6, F4, Knight to D5. He's willing to give himself an isolated pawn for some piece activity. Knight takes, pawn takes. Now Dan goes all out for an attack and he plays F5. I don't think this is the best idea. I think that Bishop to D3, preparing F5 was a much better decision. But okay. F5, Queen C5, and this kind of really puts White's attack to a grinding halt here because he can't take the knight on E6 because his queen on E3 is hanging, and if he trades queens, the knight's no longer hit. There's no big attack on it. But Dan does get some pressure out of this. Now, probably it is best to play Knight to G4 here. He didn't. He played F6, a very tempting move. But after E takes F6, E takes F6, King to G8, it looks very, very cramping to have that king on G8. And if the white queen were not pinned, Queen to H6 would spell doom rather quickly. You put the queen there, find a way to sack for that knight on E6, and then you deliver mate on G7. But because of the situation with the queens, there's no worries for black. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen, bishop to F3, rook F to D8, knight G4, knight to E4, And now I think that best is to play bishop takes, pawn takes, and then king f2. The idea is to just get to e3 and aim for a slightly better endgame. Instead, Dan played knight to h6 check, king to f8, bishop takes e4 here, d-e4, rook to fe1, king to e8, knight to g4. It was really a wasted tempo of that knight coming around because the black king has just been able to move himself closer to the center. Armit takes on d1, rook takes d1, rook to c8, and now a bit of panic here, c3. Let's step back for a moment because this position is worthy of some investigation. There's a phrase that Marine Lieutenant Nathaniel Fick likes to use, and that's observe everything, admire nothing. And that's what White should have done here. He should have observed that, yes, his pawn on c2 was hit, but he shouldn't admire it so much that he has to instantly react to it. Always be on the offensive. That's the key thing. Always be looking for what you can do to your opponent before your opponent can do anything to you. So what White should have played here was knight to e5. And the reason the pawn on c2 can't be taken, well, let's take a look at that. Rook to d7. We're hitting the bishop on b7. Okay, so black is in a world of hurt after rook to d7. If he goes bishop to c8, you go rook to e7, check, king f8, rook takes f7, king goes back, we check again. If he goes to d8, we got knight f7 is mate, so he's got to go back. Now we threaten mate again, and if he goes here to be able to prepare bishop to g1, well, we could play rook to h8 check, bishop g1 and f7, or we could just play rook over to here. We're threatening to take the pawn on a6. It's just a miserable life for black. And if he goes to a8 with the bishop, then we go check, here, check, and then mate. So, back here in the bishop a8 line, instead of king f8, he can go to king to d8, whereas in the other line, with the bishop on c8, that would allow knight takes f7 mate. So here he can do this, knight takes f7, and this is just as bad as mate. White's going to get a queen. Alright, so rook to d7 is just a killer move here. So, going back even further after knight to e5, being aggressive rather than passive and playing c3 as in the game, rook to c5 looks to be the best defense here. And here again, rook to d7, rook takes e5, rook takes b7, rook to f5, going after the pawn on f6, rook e7, king f8, rook takes pawn, and we have a dead level game. Okay, maybe White has some practical chances here because he's got the majority on the queen side, but I mean, we have to face the facts that this is pretty level. Back in our game, after black played rook to c8, Dan played c3, now rook to c6, and I believe that black is standing better here. Okay, a bit better. Maybe not winning, but I'd rather have black. Rook to d5, and now h5. It might have been worth it to flick in rook to e6 first, and then if rook to d4, h5 now, knight to e3, rook takes f6. Everything's guarded, black's up a pawn. And if rook to g5, we play h5, and again, black is going to win that pawn on f6 and be up a pawn. The problem is after h5, White's got an in-between move that saves him. Rook to e5 check. Now king to f8 and knight to f2. So that after rook takes, he can play knight takes. And we're dead level on material, and the position is equal, and should probably end in a draw. So we're going to go through many of these moves rather quickly until we hit a point where one side or the other goes astray. A4 is probably technically a better way to handle this ending, try and keep your rook active rather than passive. Rook to e2, king to g7, king to f2, f5, king to e1, king to f6. Okay, the players are doing what they're supposed to, bringing their kings to the center so they can support their rooks. And here, white plays rook to c2, rook to c6. Now, white should play rook to d2. It is of utmost importance to have your rooks active as much as possible in rook and pawn endings. White plays b3, king to e5. I'm not sure whether Dan realized it or not, but black is standing a bit better here. His king is much superior to the white king, and black's rook has a bit more activity to it than the white's rook. King to e2, king to e4. Now king to d2. Now already white's at a bit of a crossroads of how to approach this endgame. It's difficult to say what should be played here. You know, rook to d2, you lose the pawn on c3. You push that pawn, you end up with an isolated pawn over there. Not good. The only other place that you can take action would be maybe the king side. Maybe you could try h4 here. Now to king f4, c4 at this point because the king's too far away from it. King to g3, king to e3, and now f4, check, king to e4, and pawn takes on c4, pawn takes, now f3, so that after pawn takes, king takes, king to d5, rook to c8, now rook to g2. This is a level game, but it would take some guts to go into this for both players. Very difficult, because white has some threats with the c-pawn, the black has some threats with bringing the g-pawn up the board. Unclear, I guess would be the best way to say it. Dan played king to d2, rook checks. You know, perhaps f4 was a little bit stronger, but rook checks. King to e2. Now I thought rook to d3 would be a strong move. He did not play that. He played rook to c6, king to d2. Again, here he could go for that h4 line, but king to d2. And now black decides to stop that idea of h4 and plays h4 himself. King to e2, king to f4, king to f2, rook to c5. Now here Dan figures that the kings are far enough away from the queen side that he can try c4. But this is an inaccuracy. Let's step back. a4 was probably a better try. b4, c4, king to e4. I think black is still holding an edge here, but it's not easy for him to prove it's a win. However, after c4, things start to open up a bit more here. A nice move by Armit. He plays a5, which forces white to play king to e2. But he misses that. He plays b4. This is a bad mistake. This loses the game, actually. Let's step back for a moment. King to e2, just bringing the king in closer so that when that pawn is isolated, he can bring his king up to protect it. And his rook on c2, though passive, is protecting the g-pawn as well. Black stands better here, but again, it's doubtful whether it's winning. But after a5 and b4, white is losing by force. A takes b4, a takes b4, rook takes c4, rook takes c4. Well, this is check. It might be worth a try playing this, but I think that black is still winning from this position. So rook takes c4. This is just a losing king-pawn ending. We're going to go through this rather quickly. B takes c4, b5. Now, of course, you have to play king to e5. c3 would only lead to a draw. King to e5, king to e3, king to d5, b6, king c6, king d4, king takes b6, king takes c4, and pop. We have the opposition built in. King d4, king d6, king e3, has to give way because of the pawn on f5, king e5, maintaining the opposition. King to f3, we go for the diagonal opposition, but g5 is pure and simple. repairs f4, and then you'll just outflank the enemy king. g3 was tried. Really not much else to do. Pawn takes, now f4. King f3, king f5. Opposition once again. Now king to e2, king to e4, king to f2, f3, king to f1, king to e3, king to e1, f2 check, king to f1. And now, how would you finish the game if you were playing black? Black to move and mate in 4. Okay, here you can play king to f3. Now it's stalemate except for h4. Now I think that Dan was hoping that he would take this and then he'd score half a point. But such is not the case. Armit played g4 and Dan resigned at this point, realizing that after h5, g3, h6, g2 is checkmate. Nice game by Armit. There was no tactical melee to come to grips with. It was a very positional game from start to end. And he handled himself very nicely in the rook and pawn ending. Dan became impatient, opted for a couple passive moves, and that's all it took. And then when he played b4 here, in this position, he ended up in a losing position because this rook and pawn endgame and the king and pawn endgame are both losing for white. Alright folks, that's it for this video. I hope to stay tuned for future feature games from round 5 and round 6. Hopefully I'll be able to bring round 6 maybe around Friday or so. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this, and until next time, good luck.